always eat salads, and even in Lebanon, you can find salads, so you can eat everywhere. Okay, now, meat. How do you eat meat? When? How often? What's the frequency of the lion? Much more random. Okay, so by the time Christianity developed, they realized that people were eating too much meat. They're too rich along the cities of the Mediterranean. So the Greek Orthodox religion bans us from eating meat except at festivals. So we have 200 days of vegan. And effectively, to restore the frequency and composition, when people say, well, I'm vegetarian, I'm paleo, okay, all these make no sense if you don't introduce a second order effect, which is the second dimension. Incidentally, this is a second order effect that I showed on a graph. So let's talk about modern times. Question is modern times. We no longer have to walk to destinations because they invented this thing that make noise, prevent speeches, all right, called buses, cars. No? Okay. How do we compensate for it? Same way. Someone invented something called the gym, which has the total absurdity where I live of people driving for 25 minutes, parking the car that they use, getting in a gym, getting on a carpet that walks, and walking on it. No? Well, that's exactly how you re-inject some stressors that are absent because we control the environment too much. All right? Same thing in the hotel where I was today, thermal variability. There's a room where you go in to get hot because you have air conditioning all the time. So United Room, and in Qatar, interestingly, I'm sure they won't let me in the state of Qatar today, but I'm saying before I discovered that they weren't the nicest people to humanity, all right, with their financing of ISIS, I went to Qatar, okay, and I discovered that they had a reverse sauna, because in Qatar, it's not like Singapore. If you want a sauna, you don't have to pay for it. You just walk outside, right? So what did they do in Qatar? They have a room where you walk in and minus 15 degrees centigrade. You walk in, you spend a few minutes, it's like you freeze, and then come out of it, take a shower, and then go back to work, you see. So we're introducing these things artificially, okay? And now there are even some people who run, jogging, doing marathon, all these crazy things, all right? Simply because our life doesn't give us that anymore, okay? So effectively, what do is we have had these antidotes because controlling our environment came with civilization. So we've had these antidotes for these things.
So just about a point that you just mentioned, because you brought in ISIS over there. So you mentioned that the Levantine or the Middle Eastern kind of religions have practiced things which inculcate antifragility, like imposing fast as a way to harness the inherent antifragility of the human body.
Interrupt. Not to harness antifragility, to compensate for civilizations, okay, making life too easy for us.
Okay. So if these religions have been following these principles at their heart and trying in some way to nudge people back towards at least trying to compensate for the lack of stressors, then why have we reached this situation where these same kind of religions are in a situation where it's creating a huge amount of disorder?
Okay, where what? Sorry.
So Islam.
The last word, the bus. Yeah.
So Islam, for instance, is now being viewed as creating a huge amount of disorder.
Doing what?
Creating a huge amount of disorder.
Creating disorder. Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. So the purpose of religion, okay, isn't like religions don't. There's one thing that people don't really get about religion, is that it's not a device, all right, to done by some elite to impose anything. Religions, I don't know if you know that, but at the time Islam came in Arabia, there were exactly 360 different gods in the Kaaba. and different sects being worshipped, and that's what they say, and one for every day of the year. Maybe they have a different year count than we do today, the rounding, right? So it's 360. So there were a lot of things. And it so happens that it's not the religions that survive, it's those who have a certain characteristic. Okay, religions may seem completely irrational, but certain practices, those practices, that are more favorable for, our survival, cause the religions to multiply, you see? And to give you, for example, there's a kashrut law in Judaism where you have to have 2 kitchens, no? I don't know how practical it is to tell people to have 2 kitchens. It is not, okay, but the side effect of having 2 kitchens, so it complicated 540 dietary restrictions, if you want to follow it precisely, forces you to only eat with members of your religion. So it cause some unity and some strengths, at times of disorder. Okay, so to answer your question, after this description of what comes with the religion, Islam was a response to the environment, okay, about 1300 years ago. And it came with Ramadan to force people to fast effectively, because people were already then pre-diabetic in the peninsula, probably for being rich in the cities. And it worked, but it came with a lot of things that were very useful then, you see. Today, these things are not useful. And the second point that people don't know about Islam is that, I don't know if you buy yourself a copy of the Quran, and it gives first of all, it's vague enough so you can read in it whatever you want. But definitely it doesn't deliver ISIS, you see, because it starts with the 3 religions that are in a good path: Christianity, Judaism, and the third one called Saba'i, which has disappeared. It's a form of Gnosticism that was monotheistic at a time. So that's the Baqarah, that's number 1. So you start with number 1, that these guys are good people, all right? And then you hear bin Laden shouting something else. So you realize that what we call religions is mutations that have happened recently, or happen all the time, taking different shapes. You can interpret things the way you want. The texts are either vague enough, or the interpretations dominate. And the other thing is that we have an aberration in the religion sphere, something called Saudi Arabia, that invented the brand of Islam that was not matching the scriptures. So Saudi Arabia invented that form of purity of Islam, you see? So I don't want to get into religion because that's not my department, except that I'm a Christian from the Near East, so I'm very concerned when about a monster called Saudi Arabia. But aside from that, what I would have to say about religion is that the population that survive tend to have the rules that are needed for fitness. And religions are just an instrument to get these rules, because religion forces you to do something. You see, the difference between religions and diet, and I don't know if many of you have been on a diet, okay? But you go on a diet, you say, okay, you have diet low carb. What low carb means will change in definitions throughout the day, depending if you're in front of a nice French restaurant, pastry chef or not, you see? But religion is much easier, because the definition of no pork means no pork. It's not like on Mondays you can have 100 grams, no more. You see the idea? So that kashrut law, that halal law that comes with religion, forces people to not think when implementing them. And this is why they transmit much better in a cleaner form. But let's avoid discussions of that you can read on the Huffington Post, like religion, and let's talk about something deeper.
Professor, the gentleman in front there.
Yeah, he has no hair. It's good. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, Professor.
Yeah.
I just want to ask, if we want to live a life of antifragility, means we have to take small losses every day, and hopefully some positive X want in a very long period of time.
Okay, I don't have the board to show you what. Yeah, but
Okay.
Yeah.
For your experience, how we can stand for the small losses, maybe for 10 years, 20 years? Can you share your personal experience?
I want to say the opposite. You start out anti-fragile not by making bets that pay big and have small losses, but by doing what you do, by avoiding bets that make huge losses. If you just do that naturally, then you're exposed to you don't constrain the upside, you just make sure you constrain the downside. And people fail to understand that anything that survived today, any industry that survived today, is an industry that knows how to clip the downside. In finance, they're incapable of it because they're smart in finance. The smartest people work in finance. But when it's not your money, you're not as smart as when it's your money, you see. So somehow they suddenly leave about 70 to 80 IQ points in the, at the code check, all right, in finance when making some classes of decision, and then recover the IQ point when they go to do math and quantitative finance, all that stuff. So this is what happens, is that it's not their money, they start having some reasoning that's crazy, okay? And that's human nature.
I believe we have one question on the left audience here.
Where's the question?
Yes, Professor. Professor?
Yes.
First, thank you for coming to Singapore and for your profound, irreverent, and often iconoclastic insights.
Thanks.
I'm a retired oil trader. I lecture on risk management. I figure I should admit that to you. And I've read your books. I find them very insightful. But about a year and a half ago, you wrote an article in The Economist, which really made a deep impression on me, where you talked about the mechanism known as value at risk. You said, let's ban the risk management technique known as value at risk.
Yeah.
This is, your quote, pure intellectual fraud. That's very profound, but in lecturing to local universities, talking to clients, I echo that sentiment, but the response you get from risk managers is, well, yes, it's imperfect, but it's the best we have. I would just wonder if you could share some insights.
Yeah.
If value at risk is pure intellectual fraud, what would you recommend in its place?
That's the point. So let's play the thought experiment to see how people in finance have reasoning that is so illogical and you can check it by changing domain to apply it in the real world, okay? Let's say tomorrow we're boarding a plane to go from Singapore to Jakarta. And the pilot announces, we don't have a map of Jakarta, but you have a map of Honolulu instead. But we're going to take the best map we have. What do? You get off the plane, you swim, you take a boat, you walk, you don't go to Jakarta, you agree? So, but in finance, it's completely different because it's not your money. You see the idea? So instead of saying, let's see what risks we understand and take them, in finance, someone takes risks, and there's a person called the risk manager who's completely, who has some kind of, sort of the equivalent of a damage in their logical chain to be able to take that job, to say, okay, we're going to try to find ways to analyze risks that others aren't taking. You don't realize that decision making is inseparable, you see. And in your daily life, you see how logical we are. If the guy tells you, I'm going to use a map of Honolulu because I got nothing better, okay, you don't, just complain. But when I told, and this is actually 20 years ago, and not 20 years, 18 years ago, I said that it was a fraud, value at risk. I keep saying this is fraud, and every time people came back with the same argument, right? That, hey, do you have something better? But don't take those risks for which you need to analyze tail event. And the other thing is, actually, I have something better. That idea of to track acceleration in a tail. Simply, we cannot measure tail risk. So you're not going to tell me there's something better to analyze something, that you cannot randomize when you're on a plane a map of Jakarta. You don't have a map of Jakarta, stay home. There are a lot of other things you could do in life other than go to Jakarta if you don't have a map of Jakarta, you see? And so this is very, very, very easy to understand in daily life. Translated into language, what's the reason? The reason, this argument actually drove me to write a paper and to discuss something called skin in the game. What is a skin in the game? It's very similar to the idea of religion and survival, okay? If you have a habit that tends to kill other people without killing you, all right, without killing yourself, that habit is not good for society. You agree? So, and that would lead to the explosion, and it's not sustainable in the long run. And let's now, there's such a things as cars on the street, but they can't go very fast here. But on highways, they can go quite fast. Okay, in Europe, you have about 30,000 people dying on the roads, but it's nothing huge compared per mile, and it's very low. And you wonder why, when you're on a highway, why someone doesn't go wild and kill 40 people. Why doesn't that happen? Can someone explain to me why? Sorry? Because these people are dead. Those capable of harming others are already dead. So in other words, people tend to take risks, inflict on other risks that they inflict on themselves at the same time. So you can't keep killing people on the road without eventually dying. And that's part of the fragility argument. You cannot impose fragility on others without being fragile yourself. Now, when it comes to risk management and academia, you don't have that. Because, and this is recent, because these people teach you models. If the model is wrong, you're the one who paid the price, and they always can spin a story, you got nothing better. If you got something better, Talib, come show me something better. Show me your capabilities. That kind of argument. But in real life, these people are dead. To follow this argument. So you can have a multiplication of people with defective logic in places like economic departments, but you will not have it in surgery. Because in surgery, if you make a mistake, you have skin in the game, you're taken out, and people know your track record and mistake. You're operating. So this is why we have that notion of skin in the game came to me as a generalized way to say that those who impose harm on others need to, have exactly the same risk. And it's part of ethics. It's eye for eye. It was always in societies, and that idea of skin in the game only disappeared recently. In the past, ISIS beheads people now gratuitously, but in Europe they used to behead bankers. You see. So, I'm not asking to behead bankers, but you have to penalize those who impose harm on the collective, right? And, we stopped having skin in the game only about a generation ago as a norm for the functioning of society. And skin in the game doesn't have to be literal. If you drive your car, you have financial liabilities. Actually, the eye for eye is not literal, as I discovered in the Talmud. They in the Talmud said, it cannot be literal. Why it can't be literal? Think about it. Say if it's eye for eye, and a blind man goes around removing people's eyes, all right? You can't punish him, all right? Or a person has one eye, removes two eyes from someone. Say, oh no, the law, you get the idea. So it has to be non-literal. In other words, it has to be equivalent harm done to the person, which in the case of a surgeon, is high enough a penalty to remove bad surgeons very quickly from the system. You see, and that's what you want. You don't want to punish, you want to remove the person and inflict the damage on others. So I'm glad, you see, I've used value at risk to get to skin in the game, which is the golden rule of society.
Okay, this one, the second row.
Professor Talib, is it possible to be convex and long volatility in the long term, but avoid the costs of that by being short volatility and concave in the short term?
Okay, this is obvious because I wrote about it in dynamic hedging. Most people confuse volatility and risk, and in dynamic hedging, I say typically if you have an exposure to the tail, you need to be short the movement in the body. But that's too fancy a question, and it's answered in my 1998 dynamic hedging. I'm not selecting the fellow here, so if you want to get angry, I get angry with him. But it has to be gender equivalent and hair density equivalent also.
Okay, perhaps I'll have a lady this time.
There we go.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Just now you mentioned that you could measure fragility and antifragility, and I was wondering whether you could walk us through a demonstration of that, perhaps using the case of Singapore, since we're here. So what is the anti-fragility of Singapore now
okay.
versus 5 or 10 years ago?
Okay, the fragility or anti-fragility that you measure is with respect locally to a certain variable. So in other words, I can measure the fragility of a portfolio with respect to certain random shocks based on acceleration of harm, and I can infer. So it's something very precise. The anti-fragility of a country is something you can discuss, but you have fragility and anti-fragility with respect to different variables. For example, I could be very fragile emotionally, all right? Someone asks me a question on something or irritates me with value at risk, I get into wild rage, while at the same time, being able to get a rock on my head and be more robust than others. You get the idea. So you have to specify the thing. I am certain that your generation in Singapore is probably not as strong as the parents simply because you've had a comfortable life. This works too well, no? So, and I'm sure the parents complained about it. I'm sure I'm not the first person to say it because that's what parents always say, generation to generation. My parents were told by their parents, you have it too easy. Look, we had a rough way. So I'm sure that you have that. So I'm not going to give you any information that you didn't get from your parents, all right? So, but with success comes some kind of comfort, and comfort is not always good. You need some, as we said, we need some stressor. You need to take your body to the gym, like you need to take things. Now, there's something that people don't realize. The success of all city-states is wonderful, a success story, city-states, okay, for several reasons. Number one, because of this acceleration of harm, an elephant is vastly more fragile than a mouse, if you take the scale, but an elephant is vastly more efficient than a mouse. The plumbing, when you take something large, the plumbing, like if you double the size, okay, of the animal, you don't need to double the number of arteries. You see, it scales, you only need 70% more arteries to satisfy, which is why an elephant needs only a few hours sleep, whereas a mouse needs to sleep all the time, almost, you see? So as you get large, you get more efficient, but you get more fragile to random shocks. The small has some properties that work very well. So Singapore has pretty much the optimal size. And people don't realize that it's a quality because, and instead of comparing political systems across the globe, they don't realize that there's something in physics called scaling. That scale is vastly more important than anything else. You see, scale is more important than political regime, this, and that. I mean, you can compare countries like Lebanon and Syria. They eat the same food, have the same bad jokes, have the same good jokes, the same ethnicities, the same, all right, but Lebanon is a fifth of the size of Syria, okay, and the same GDP, okay? You realize. So, okay, so you have this, the story of city-states is right with it. There's another effect. Why do maritime city-states, okay, why do they do so well? Okay, all right. So there's something very interesting, is that it turned out that a country that has difficulties eating, I don't think you have a lot of farmland here or ever had a lot of farmland here, no? Okay, so the Phoenicians, Byblos, right across from Cyprus, had very little resources. So they had to import everything. So they needed to go to Cyprus to get copper. Now, to go to Cyprus, what do you need to import copper? You need boats, no? They figured out if you have a boat that brings copper from Cyprus, what are you going to do with it? Sell other stuff, use it for other stuff where you're not using it for copper. So that's a mechanism of overcompensation where effectively you're turning the waters around you into gold. And that's the story of the Hanseatic League, of Venice, Genoa, all the maritime city-states in the Phoenician world. And you don't need a large state for that. You don't need infrastructure. The ocean is right there, so it is perfect. You don't need to be large because you don't need big train systems. You don't need all that stuff. Let the Europeans build it. So city-states have flourished around coastal areas, mostly as ports, self-sufficient ports. They tend to, as another attribute, that they tend to love commerce. They don't like war. War is something that more landlocked peasants tend to do, but not city-states, the more sophisticated. And this is one quality that you'll always have. So you'll always be okay from that standpoint, that the minute you stop being super competitive, you die. Whereas other countries can afford to be complacent. You see, you don't have oil. If you discover oil in Singapore, then you'll be in trouble. But until then, you're okay. You're not Qatar. Basically, they can't, if they lose their oil in Qatar, they can't do anything. They can't even drive your car. I mean, they can't do anything. The level of skills in these countries is very, very low, okay? So I have to say that if you look at different levels, that Singapore is probably the ideal state in size, the ideal state in stability, the ideal state in governance, because the maturity is very, very high. The ideal state, Switzerland, here, small states have that maturity. And if you've been rich because of that, okay, maybe you need, they need to put you through summer camp somewhere, right, to toughen you up a little bit. That's the only bad thing. Maybe they should create mandatory summer camps where you had no electricity, no thing, random, they wake you up randomly at night. Sorry? You have that? You have military service? Okay, so there we go. They have a couple of say they even thought of that, all right? Yeah, because the French eliminated their military service. And with the loss of military service, the French, they lost a lot of that, you know, that natural antifragility that you develop when they force you, you know, to rough it up.
I've been a risk engineer in HP for 5 years, traded option strategies for 7 years. So I have some familiarity with the theories, right? 2 of the books. So 2-part question. First, about black swans. Is it possible that perhaps these things are only evident after the fact? For example, if we take the First World War, it started, according to a lot of people, with a teenager who is a bookworm trying to assassinate and succeeding the Archduke.
Okay, I suggest, because others want to ask question to speak. Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
And
so after that, the